Between the time when chaos broke Cadia and the return of the sons of their emperor, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Kronan, wearer of the jeweled crown of Aquilonia, upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure. Where mesh the gubbins and the muggins to grind between their ever-chewy gobs the flesh and bits and soul stuff of the boys and the infernal. Where roars the anus furnace, its flames cope to devour, its heat to take life with searing squittiness unto volcanic hot stuff with body bubbles that burneth. There does he find you, there does he see you. And in the seeing, does he know your heart, your behind, your backhand slice? There loiters Bashtorr, the arse frame, and crumping is his gift. And so it was that our mighty hero, Kronan, the Cunning One, Lord of all of Aquilonia, had dominated his world of origin, the first of his kind to defeat the Humies in open war. The only orc, orky enough to bring the disparate tribes of his kind together under the one banner, his banner, and his Kunnin war. Kronan had seen off pretenders, crushed a chaos-worshipping bag of excrement called Toba, had bested not only armies of the Humies, but even their legendary Angles of Death, the Arse-starters, and their prim anus knobs. But more than this, he had been guided on his way to greatness by none other than Mork himself, the god of Kunnin brutality, twin to Gork, god of brutal Kunnin, the only two gods the orcs ever needed. And as the turn of the ages shifted again, a huge punch-up was in the offing. For the Eldar called it the Banana Rama, some called it the Woof Time, others the Time of Bending. But all who were in the know, well, they knew the dung was about to hit the fan. And so it was that the great gods of the orcs had chosen their own heralds, their own prophets. And Gork had moved through the auspices of his mighty son Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka, the hero of Armageddon, the crusher of the Buggins at Octarius, the bane of old Baelai. Yet Mork was hardly sitting around with his thumbs up his posterior. He had rather taken a shine to our hero, Kronan, the Cunning One. He had gifted him with the wit to see, the will to perform that most dread of activities. For Kronan was known for his mighty cogitations. In a word, thinking. And so it was that he had outthought and outfought all he had come across. But more! Mork had sent signs and portents, had guided Kronan to the home of the orcs, to Alinor itself. And now Kronan was in possession of the first chopper, Haknien. With it as an icon of favor from the great god Mork, his authority was now unquestionable. Well, more because of his prodigious size, his known fightiness, and ability to crump literally anything he had ever seen. Kronan was the prophet of Mork. He was, undeniably, the Cunning One. And so it was that Kronan had begun a sector-spanning war, for he knew that a massive fight was being waged across the stars elsewhere, with a huge array of the armies of the Imperium to be collected. For none had many reasons for his actions these days, but surely one of the most important was a wish to pit himself against the power and skill of the Gold Ones. The armies of the Imperium were as vast as the stars they commanded, all ridiculously named, of course, but a myriad nonetheless. And some could be quite fighty when pushed into a corner. Kronan wanted to collect all of the anal minitantrum regiments, of course he did. He was not sloppy, or any lickspittle or lollygagger, and he would not sniff at a chance to beat down some of the smaller, pointy-nosed and white-haired arse-starters. But he really wanted to go through their best, the Space Marines. When he had gone through the tipplers, the marinaders, the silly man-bears, and the rest, then, oh then, he might be able to unlock the Gold Ones, the best of the best, the Hume Emperor's greatest warriors, the Cuts-Oders. And this was his most cherished personal goal, an outside chance, but worth a shot. If he got them all, collected them all, then surely the Humies would have no choice but to feed him the Gold Ones. Yet, this would require for there to be a war to end all wars. For the Humies were known to have a massive empire, and they ignored or ran away from most things. So Kronan knew he had to get into the biggest action he could find. A crop of Humies that would all but guarantee the Gold Ones when you had pulled off the rest of the wrapping. And so, Kronan was now almost ready. He was about to begin his war in earnest, and crusade across the stars on a rampage of pure savagery, and of course brutality, as his great god Mork intended. Now, it must be noted that the muster itself did take a minute, for even when Kronan returned and was hailed by all to be the prophet of Mork, well, again actually, but for some reason it never got boring to Kronan, nor to Tiddles, for he would be excited when he saw his master so hailed. Perhaps it was the jubilation, the boisterous laughter, or perhaps it was because few would keep their attention on the now 10-foot ball of fanged fury, and he would be able to snaffle a few of the least effusive celebrants at the back of any crowd. Not that many would attempt to stop Tiddles in any of his snacking patterns, if truth be told, and we always like to be truthful on the Chronicles. But Kronan got knocked off with him at times when someone he was almost fond of was consumed whilst carrying something Kronan had demanded brought to him, which was quite rare actually. But Tiddles did like to attempt to be a good boy for his master, and that is a rare squig indeed. And while we are on the subject of the Wall of Hate, things had rather changed for Kronan's pet squig. His very first loyal attendant, Tiddles had been a boon time and time again. And nary had a pet ever been more loyal to their master. And as Kronan had grown, not only in station, but also in girth and stature, so too had his pet. And as Kronan was now the largest orc anyone in this sector had seen, sans the mighty prophet of Gork, of course, Gazgul, thus too was Tiddles now enormous. And this had actually caused some problems, some issues. But then, most orcs found them amazingly amusing. Well, as long as they were not on the receiving end, of course. For Tiddles was now so prodigious in his volume that he was no longer able to traverse many of the corridors, crawl spaces and avenues of the ships on which Kronan took him, and this had led to a strange situation indeed. For as Kronan would be noticeably vexed if his pet was not present, or at least the boss of bosses knew where he was. Thus had it become for Tiddles and his own pet, Happy Len. The poor grot was ostensibly the aid of Hippocrates, and actually really enjoyed working for the Pain Boy. Alas, this meant that he would be in the segments that Tiddles could not get to, and this had led to the squig getting pangs and loitering around regions that led to the confined Pain Boy's decks of the ship. And if Tiddles had to wait too long, he would either get very angry and go on a one more rampage that could slay scores, or would identify a proxy, a stand-in. A grot, or even a full boy, would be adopted by the squig, but either when it did not perform as Happy Len would do, or when Happy Len finally materialized again, Tiddles would discard his proxy. Well, he discarded them into his stomach, was a more accurate statement. So now it became difficult for Len. Because all wished him to assist Hypocrates, of course. The Pain Boy was working miracles on the boys. But they far more wished to be saved from the predations of a very erratic and almost neurotic huge sphere of consuming, slathering, toothy destruction. Hence Len had much pressure on him to spend increasing time with Tiddles. All, of course, while Kronan was away on another ship in the fleet, because Tiddles only really needed his emotional support grot when his master was away. It had started during the Squig Games, or more to put it, the period before, when Kronan had been captured by that scum, Tober, and his boss, Two Smasher. The Squig had fretted so badly that he followed Daka von Smashhoven to the camp of the Speed War. But we have already heard about these details in depth. Now, Tiddles did not seem to believe in the invulnerability of his master when he was not present. And Tiddles, being a squig, was not intelligent, but on some animalistic, squiggy level. He was all too aware of how he could not simply get to another ship if Kronan was in trouble. And he pined. So he turned to his pet, Happy Len, for consolation. Now there did become a mild tension when some bosses wished Kronan would take less time visiting each new ship or flotilla that joined the gargantuan Waaargh. Well, after the right of first contact, of course, as we have discussed. All because of Tiddles. Then, of course, there was the other attendants pressuring Len. But Hippocrates was a big boss, and could be vile in his revenge if he required Len for a particularly important or fiddly process. Hence, he would release bowel-borer squigs across a ship if kept waiting too long, which was deeply unpleasant. Of course, when an embassage came to bring this up with Kronan himself, he quickly invoked the rule of 3 and began pasting them all. Not a fatal beating, but a good roughing up for certain, and that was the end of it. Being brought up to Kronan anyways. Now to grots. As we all know, they had a particular import in Book 1, but such is the will of the gods. For all in the circle of Orky strife are of import in this tale, and effectively, this is a lore channel, so it behooves me to at least pass on some gems amongst the dross of my unrelenting verbiage. And so it was that the grots were now in a rather strange position, for the energies of the Waaargh had seen them balloon in numbers across the entire gathering, and the admirals of the fleets, the individual freebooter skippers too, all found themselves practically drowning in them. None really knew why the grots were so prolific under Kronan, for he seemed to be the only variance in play, and this led to rather unorthodox approaches to meet the scenario. And thus did Kronan consider the situation in a mighty cogitation. He cleared his mind, approached the deck he had arranged for this purpose exclusively. He opened the doors and went inside. For only he could tread these hallowed floors. Well, apart from a hand-picked corps of runt herds to replenish stocks. Not stalks, mind you, as that was a definite no-no due to previous events. Stocks of grots only, capiche? And so it was that Kronan walked to the fire. Racks of writhing, sacred thinking grot covered its walls and ceiling in cages. He pulled on, well, some pulleys, and a crop came down for him. He set to taking them out, still manacled in a chain, and spread them over a huge hearth before him. He looked into the fires, and slowly roasted one by one as he absently tugged on the chain when one was spent. They were suspended over the fire by about 10 inches actually, and he would use his idle arm to slowly turn them on the spit. The moaning, the screaming, the defiance was there. The ambience perfect. He could feel it, the cunning rising, and so he began to think. The Grots. Why? Why did they proliferate so much under his rule? Were they linked to it somehow? Were they the epitome of Kunnin? Not that he thought that exact sentence, but it was the general drift. Kronan considered the squigs, the snots, the squigots, as he had been trained to do on his holiday. Then boys, knobs, and finally, back to Grots. After searching his soul and mind for what seemed an eternity, he came to the same conclusion as he always did. Grots? They were necessary, but tantamount to useless the vast majority of the time. And then it hit him, like a thunderbolt to the side of the head. It was not the Grots themselves that mattered. It was, as with everything else, what he did with them that counted. Kronan continued his introspection. He was onto something here. For had he not deployed them in so many ways? Origrotmi, thinking, Origrotmi, and more. And it was clear to him now, finally. The Grots were multiplying, as a gift from Mork. An abundance to be used. And so it was that Kronan now knew that the morale-raising events he had brought in, Thinkmas, the Cowl's cogitation, amusement, there could be no end to the use of the little terrors. For that was just one part of the loyalty he had garnered from all of the burgeoning Waaargh, as he had before on Aquilonia. Kronan had made an effort to know as many of his Waaargh as possible. They were loyal to him, even above their own bosses in many mobs. It was because of one simple fact. With Kronan, it was never, ever dull. Kronan brought flair and fun to the event, not just Kunnin, and his boys loved him for it. I mean, they really adored him. Thus, Kronan added this illuminated need to the long list required to truly make a tribe, or Waaargh, of orcs continue, to make them stronger. They would need fighting, more fighting, gubbins and muggins and foodstuffs, the new addition of entertainment, and of course, more fighting. Fights and circuses, that is all he needed. But this introspection into the very soul of the orc, well, it put him head and shoulders above all other bosses. And so, thus armed with true, incontrovertible wisdom, Kronan basked in the blossoming, unfolding cornucopia of opportunities for a good giggle. All, unsurprisingly, employing vast amounts of grots. And thus, the entertainments began. Now few of the Speed Waaargh's initial core tribe had been willing to state their protestation, nor would it have done any good. But Kronan began his own squig games, but used grots instead. His boys were far too precious. He needed them. Obviously, the trials were far more basic and easier to survive than the ones that had been the initiation of the orcs. But the carnage was a roaring success amongst the knobs. He added in widely advertised Squigoth surprise events as well, which were possibly even more popular. For Kronan always liked to see if he could now take many heads with the one swing, and so it was that he not only provided sumptuous enthrallment to his people, but he kept their Waaargh skills up too. For he ordered the teleporters to be used to send thousands of the diminutive greenskins into surprise visits to the Squigoth holding pens. Of course, the Squigoths were massive and generally gnarly at being confined on ships when they were used to roaming the plains of Aquilonia. And so it was that they were startled beyond conception when bright lights flooded their pens and hundreds of the blighters, the grots, appeared amongst them. Of course, the Squigoths would rampage, stamping and goring entire phalanxes of the grots. And it could go on for hours as the Squigoths hunted around their pens for any last grot. In this way, the Squigos also kept in shape, and the mech boys improved their accuracy and efficiency in using the dreaded teleporters. And Kronan was proud. But this was only the beginning, for Kronan also arranged inter-flotilla golf matches. Now, golf was a simple acronym for an incredibly rewarding pastime. It stood for Grot Overship Live Firing. Not that anyone really understood the terms used, well, apart from grot and firing. Live as well, I guess. It's odd how you can use a term that uses words everyone individually knows, but put together, they mean absolutely bugger all, without context or prior knowledge. But in this case, it was actually rather logical, the moment one was aware of the intricacies of the sport. For entire leagues were now forming to compete. And this brought another wistful smile to the Cunning One, for his mobs were working together more and more with each event. Now the precise rules shifted quite a lot, but the crux of the matter was simplicity itself. First, there needed to be a target. So grots would be laced together and pushed out of the airlock and dangled down chains. These chains would then allow for the pouring of vast amounts of paint that would then mark the lines of the target area, as the grot chains were swung back and forth until either the paint ran out or the grots were let go to float in space, simply to see the look on their faces as they tried to continue holding their breath. And then, with target marked on their sheep, the two teams would climb onto the hulls of their respective vessels. They would then take turns in firing missiles across space at the other sheep. Of course, these missiles had helpful grots strapped to them. Now, the missiles were never powerful enough to go all of the way to the other sheep, but as there was no real inertia in the void, the grots would power towards a target. If the orcs were lucky or accurate, of course, and the grot would then splatter against the hull. Now they would splatter, as there was no real inertia, thus no deceleration. And soon, teeth were being traded in staggering amounts as the contests continued, and real team loyalty was engendered amongst the mobs. Origgrotmi pinned the grot on the boomsquick, Batgrot, where grots were thrown at beefy club-wielding orcs, and the distance they could bash them into space was a decider on victory. A dizzying plethora of new activities and sports involving grots was thought up by Kronan with each passing day. And all admitted that even the interminable waiting about for the get-go was not really as bad as all that, all due to Kronan and his magnificent ideas. But why was there such a period of loitering? Simple. Kronan had a plan, but he needed to check his staff, and he needed to learn much more before he could set it into motion. He needed the right orc to be in the right place at the right time, and so Kronan had to get to know his admirals. Now, Kronan had always had a strong vein of nepotism in his allocation of tasks. He liked those he knew. Even Grinner the Backstabber was gifted with honours and responsibilities he neither had earned nor deserved, the treacherous worm. Yet Kronan did not really like to give tasks to those he did not like. Alas, he had hoped that Daka von Smashoven would be able to step up. But as wonderful as the Orc flyboy was in atmosphere, or even in void fighter conflict, he was simply pants when it came to anything larger. He was an orc of speed. He needed the winds to be flowing through his hair squig, or to have enemies right in front of him to dance around in his acrobatic displays of aerial brutality. He was the best pilot any had ever met, ever witnessed, ever even heard of. But he was not fit to be a boss of the sheep of the line, let alone an entire fleet formation. And so it was that Kronan had to get to know the only two realistic candidates for the position, and an odd couple they were. Both had brought a thumping fleet of kill cruisers and escorts to the muster, but they were both oddies in the eyes of their lord, for they had to understand what Kronan had only just become aware of himself: the logs and sticks of Waaargh. Sidebar. Concerning Waaargh organization, logs and sticks. As the orcs always say, sticks and stones will break bones. Yep, that's it. So sticks were indeed important, and logs were the most fundamental to him now. Much as he despised it all, well, almost as much as a starving Dukari ghoul being forced to watch an entire collected special extended edition of the Care Bears or SpongeBob would. He knew the import of the movement of the many, the logs and sticks of it all. And Kronan's mind was dizzy with the complexity of it all. Luckily, if compared on a standard day with, say, a leader in near any other force that has ever existed in the long and quite horrific history of the galaxy, the orcs pretty much ran themselves when it came to a decent war. But even so, the vertigo-inducing reams of numbers, names, mobs, tribes, clans, freebooters and raiders under his direct authority, it was the stuff of legend. Now any other leader of any of the other aforementioned forces would probably take a somber moment, or potentially be haunted endlessly with the vast responsibility and dread weight of duty leading so many could inflict on any normal sentient. Whereas Kronan, despite being the cunning one, was still an orc. So he tried to take it all in, and then arrange them all much akin to a child sorting out its smarties. Yet, when the moment to move out would come, he was all too aware and ready for the activity it would elicit. He had walked the sands of Alanor, he had breathed its gases, had choked on its odors. He was the chosen of Mork. He had the first chopper, Hacknien. He was becoming, well, bigger mainly, for Kronan now dwarfed warbosses. Not 4 years ago he would have avoided. Oh, he would have enjoyed the scrap, nothing surer, but he would be perfectly certain of the result if it had come to it. Much like a yappy dog may growl from the safety of its owner's bag, but deep down it knows. If the Rottweiler truly wills it, both the owner and the widow Bow Wow are smears across the floor. It only need bark too long and be too annoying. Oh, there would be joyous shouting and screaming, a true furball, but the result would have been foregone. And so it was that Kronan now stood at double their size. A gargantuan big boy of legendary girth and height. To many, he would have seemed more like a square of barely contained incandescent fury, retribution, terror, and termination personified in this demi-mountain of rippling orky muscle. But, in fact, for a boss of his stature, Kronan was quite svelte, really. Well, by orc terms, anyway. Oh, he could kill anyone in the Waaargh. But he was, for a butcher of so many, who led so many, to eat so many, he was fast and nimble. Again, for a Goliath bioweapon of berserk unfettered slaughter. Anyway, it was evident to even Kronan that the more orcs there were, the more they seemed to organize themselves naturally. Pecking orders were simple, and thus there was a cohesion that he had not expected. For the orcs, though even the cunning one did not know for certain why, had been seemingly made for Waaargh. The more serious the Waaargh, the less internal strife there was. Or at the least, there was a massive reduction in the squabbling at this stage. Buggered if he knew how long this would last. He knew that his friendly frolics with the Grots were also alleviating some of the tensions that would usually result from such a congregation of so many greenskins. But he needed, from his admirals, those who could understand the needs of leadership, the truth of logs and sticks, to near match his own. End sidebar. And so Kronan interviewed his prospective admirals, those who would lead his fleets when he was not present. More tedious meeting and greeting without eating, yet it was necessary. He had to know what he was working with here, because, being earnest or frank, depending on your preferences, he was not exactly bowled over by those available. The first had a meaty reputation, both in space, winning battles against many a Hume convoy and small flotilla, and on the land. Well, stations and the like, for he was notorious for causing bloody mayhem on shore leave. His devastation of so many reputable, or even thoroughly notorious drinking deads across the sector had given him the epithet Admiral Hackbar. For nary was a one left operational after one of Hackbar's colossal benders. Most were not even standing at the end of his antics. Sounds about perfect, eh? Alas, Kronan had his reservations. The Orc had been in some form of a door accident, and his noggin was now vastly out of shape. In fact, he looked astonishingly daft with his bugged eyes and weird head. It seemed that he was captured in the moment the door slammed onto his head, and the wind must have changed, because his expression was always exactly the same now. Nor was Kronan really overjoyed with the name of Hackbar's flagship, the Gutless Wonder. Now some had stated that this was a regional misunderstanding, a mistranslation, because where Hackbar was from, it meant that he had pulled the guts out of the thing and festooned them over his vessel like a champ. It was a term of grit, determination, and utter supremacy. Alas, to Kronan it sounded much like something Grinner might have called the boast. And this did not sit right with Kronan. Nor did reports that stated that the Admiral was rather paranoid. He saw lures and hidden ambushes everywhere. Neurotic is what some would have said, instead of merely paranoid. Well, they would have done if they were humies. The Orcs just called him a bit of a wired one. Hence, this Admiral would have limited uses. Kronan just did not think he could count on the weird-looking oddie. But then, the other candidate hardly filled him with confidence either. Never seen outside of his garish tartan trousers, the shoutiest of all for light years around, or so it was said. Many in his freebooter fleet swore that they could hear him from a half a system away, vox or no vox. They called him Grand Mouth Tartan, a fearsome, stern, and surprisingly silent type. He kept his mighty bore for his orders, and they were always shouted, like really loudly. In fact, Kronan was almost of a mind to challenge him to a battle of bawling, a long duel of epic proportions. Alas, the potential whining from bloody-eared judges this would generate put him off. Kronan fancied his chances mightily, but then Kronan had a use for this most stoic of orcs. Yes he did. Yet the Grandmouth was not exactly a charmer. He did not seem like he had the makeup in his character to be the kind that Kronan could really rely on either. I mean, shouting was an admirable skill, which seemed apt, considering the position for which he was being interviewed. But could he truly elicit the kind of loyalty and discipline that Kronan required from the bosses of his collective boasts, his multitudinous stare-sheep fleet? And Kronan knew that this was possibly one of the most fundamentally important decisions he would make in the entirety of his life. For the Orc he left in charge while he was either on a boarding action or a full invasion, they had to be trustworthy, able, and proper fighty. They had to know when to get stuck in, but also when to be cunning. For the biggest fight that they were attempting to gatecrash would be a thing of wonder, and only the truly gifted warriors amongst his people would thrive and bring victory to the Waaargh. But if Kronan had to admit it, which he didn't of course, but if he had to, then he also wanted to see two things from his boss of the fleets. Either gut-curdling fear of Kronan, yet resolved to anyone else, or a love of destruction so formidable, so insatiable, that they would toe the line as Dacamon Smashoven, or Madnut, or Gitsquisher McMurder had. For these orcs knew that by merely being in the comet of the Great One, Kronan, they would see battles the likes they had never dreamed would exist. They knew that his was the bloody path blessed by Mork himself, and he would take them on his journey to greatness. But could either Hackbar or the Grand Mouth fall into this rare niche, fighting enough to be useful, but not so much as to rebel, cunning enough to be effective with his methods of war, yet not so much that they would attempt to steal his mantle and his thong, the golden thong of leadership. He had even heard now how the Emperor of the Humies had retrospectively copied him, and was presently napping on a mighty golden thong of his own. Kronan did quiz Magnat Krunkelstein on this one point, and the weird boy had confirmed it. The Humie Emperor could see into the future, is what was said. Hence, Kronan found for the next few days that he was oft bound to look about when taking a dump, just in case that odd Humie leader was watching him. But this passed when Kronan remembered he was the chosen of Mork, and anything that Rapscallion the Emperor could do, Mork could, irrefutably, do better. And so it was that Kronan decided that if the Emperor wished to watch him crap, then he could do so, for Mork would obfuscate anything the weird boy Humie wretch would find useful. Oh, yes he would. Hence Kronan forgot the slacker and went about his Waaargh again with gusto. Then it dawned on Kronan, as he reclined in his staterooms aboard his flagship, the Mork Rampant, that he could indeed use both of them, these admirals, but which to use for the two spars of his glorious wheel of crushing might he had espied in his mind's eye. For Kronan was now a master of that most deadly of obsessions, planning. He had used 2 plans at the same time before. Now he was prepared for the next step, to have 3 plans working concurrently. Even he was wide-eyed at the complexity of the collage of action and reaction that now boiled through his mind like a mile-wide flow of lava. He was excited by the potentials, the possibilities. But then he was interrupted by something he knew he should get accustomed to, it seemed. For again, he thought he must have dozed off. For yet again, his flatus had begun to form before his very eyes. Or at least, he had hoped it was his own, as otherwise someone, perhaps the Emperor, had been anally ventriloquizing a prodigious guff into his room. And as it did before, it turned to the colour of green, and seemed to solidify in front of him, and there it stood, a being of odd proportions, but most definitely sort of orky. But not just a skull this time. It was a fully developed orc form, near as huge as himself. Yet, instead of reverberating prophecy, the thing, when fully apparated, just looked at him and said, "Watcher." Kronan, still believing it a dream, a mirage of his overtaxed mind, did not even raise an eyebrow when it went on to speak to him. And so it was that this huge being of green introduced itself as Bashtorr the Arseflame. Truth be told, it was rather dramatic and annoying about the whole thing. It claimed to be a derivative being of Mork, or something like that. It claimed that once, millions of years ago, Ork did smack a rather thumper into the gob of Mork, yet Mork was laughing so hard at the last buffet it had dealt Gork, its mouth was still open, and the fist of Gork did strike the teeth of Mork, and one fell out. And this was Bashtorr. It was a part of Mork, yet a part as well. Slowly at first, it became sentient amongst the warp, and then it wandered, kicking 7 shades of poop out of everything it came across, and it walked paths it cannot tell, until finally it found a way to cross from the dreaming into the real world itself. Back and forth it went over the eons, stabbing, grappling, punching, clobbering, nutting and butting its way across the many universes. It claimed to have spent time with Tusker on the field of Waaargh before the Bronze Citadel. It claimed to have been witness to the injury and subsequent healing of Ghazghul. It claimed many, many things indeed. Yet its true ability came from the torrents of power that came from its posterior. It was Bashtorr the Arseflame, and it had good news to bring unto Kronan, for it had identified a plum job, a magnificent opportunity for them both. And Bashtorr claimed that it had appeared to Kronan before as the dramatically chatty flatus of his dreams. Bashtorr claimed to be what the Kunnin one required to defeat the forces of chaos, and that was Bashtorr's speciality, his motive force. His goal and reason to exist was to aid the Cunning One, Kronan, in his quest. For it was the will of Mork. And as a sign of his worthiness to be listened to, as a token of his power, Bashtorr proclaimed that he knew where Kronan could acquire a mighty beast to put to the very center of his war. A space hulk. A massive one. And it was close. And Bashtorr stated that he could assist and empower Kronan even more, for he knew where there were artifacts of great power. All they need do was destroy them all, and a doorway would open amongst the heavens, one that would permit the power of Mork to flow directly into real space. Like Gork's grin, but more Morkish, was how he put it. And it would grant power unto the worshippers of Mork, most especially those who knew his great works, R.E. Kronan. Throughout all of this, Kronan realized he was not a kip, for the grots above him moved and circled as usual, but they did not attempt to burn or assail each other when their paths took them within flamer range of each other, and in Kronan's dreams they always burnt each other, just as they would in reality if he were awake. And so it was that the grot stared gobsmacked down on Bashtorr, making it now irrefutable that this weird stuff was actually happening. Kronan even went as far as summoning his guard, who waited outside, and within 10 seconds, 20 mega-armored orc boys were making a semicircle around the spectral interloper. All trained their weapons on this Bashtorr, again, confirming its existence to their eyes as well as their lords. Sighing, Kronan nodded at the being and stood, allowing the seemingly orky thing to process before him to the bridge of Kronan's stair-sheep. There the mechs looked on, slack jaws dropping, drool cascading from their maws, as they viewed the odd orky being in their midst. Bashtorr strode to one of the controls, and then its fingers danced across the icons and keys they presented. And before anyone could say boo to a goose, whatever that was, there was a huge holographic display that had been sparkled into life in the middle of the room over what had, ostensibly, been deemed a nibbles desk. For the orcs, even the mechs, had not really known what the station was for, and the humies were so odd and inscrutable that only now did they fathom the use of the thing, which was probably a bit of a godsend, as otherwise they would have just shown reruns of the Squid Games on loop. Sidebar: the Squid Games footage. All in the Speed Waaargh had witnessed the unfathomably amazing orkiness of Kronan during the Squid Games, but now all could witness the sublime spectacle themselves. For it was said that weird lad, Chains Grond, Orc of Mystery, had been recording it all of the time the astonishing event had been progressing. Now some might ask where the hell the entry on Chains Grond had gone, promised over a year ago, or was it even 2? Time flies when you're a bit long in the tooth, you see. Hence, I can confirm that I did indeed start work on it, but then, like a mad snot, I plain forgot what I was doing in the whirligig of modern living, and so it was that the narrator defended himself and stated he would try to get it on to patrons soon, for it is surely not for the eyes of we snots and grots. Oh no, it is not. But let us get back to the action, knowing that all orcs, even new ones who had recently joined the Waaargh, had basked in the unadulterated spectacle of the most orky orc possible, doing what orcs do, and doing it with style, aplomb, and of course, a healthy dollop of unfettered brutality. Sidebar over. Yet now the thing calling itself Bashtorr stood with arms wide, expecting some form of congratulatory hand-clapping or something. Of course, no one did. But what was illuminated was indeed a sight for sore eyes. Or fresh eyes, really. I've no idea why sore eyes are always picked for the viewing of miracles. Surely, if it were that special of an event, then even fully rested and clear gleaming eyes would be enough to experience the event. But I digress. And so it was that there, hanging in a system only a few short hops away, was a vast and dark shape in the void of space, which made it a bit difficult to make out in all its glory. But when the image closed on it, things became clearer, for all spacefaring orcs knew this sight, knew exactly what this was. And Kronan was then subjected to a tedious lecture from Admiral Hackbar, who was present because, of course, this was the bridge of the biggest ship. Now it used to be twinned with the Admiral's own, and he had technically not given it to Kronan on his arrival, merely stated it was part of his host. But Kronan did like the Starsheep, or Boast, and decided it was a worthy gift. Previously named the Running for Cover, it was indeed the sister ship of the Gutless Wonder, but Kronan renamed it as soon as he brought his flag across to it. Not that he had a flag in reality, but it's a nautical thing, naval, you know, the senior service as one nation calls them. Either way, it was now Kronan's. And either way, he had now been updated on the reality and possibility of the existence of a space hulk so close to his burgeoning Waaargh. There could be no delay, no second guessing, for a hulk was vomited out from the warp only rarely, and it could be gathered back into the warp at any time. And so it was that Kronan did not waste a moment even to cogitate, for he knew exactly what was transpiring here, as we shall see. But this Bashtorr, the Arseflame, had identified and thus given a mighty weapon of Waaargh to Kronan, and his mighty, Waaargh. Now all that remained was to hoof it over a few systems at the head of an assault fleet, and take his prize before some greedy git beat him to the punch. Kronan had not said a single word to the being as of yet, and did not indulge now. He merely eyed it up a bit, then wheeled on his heels and stamped to the hatch. He barked a few orders and knew that within moments a segment of his fleet, if not the entire Waaargh, would be hot on his heels, and he wanted to be the first there. For every now and again, even the most loyal of boys could be led astray, and this was exactly the sort of temptation he did not want to languish in the sweaty palms of another for any moment of time whatsoever. And so, the Waaargh, only half prepared and only truly half informed, howled with glee as they fired up their engines and began to move from their flight patterns into a true mustering. Now it was immediately evident who was more in touch with their troops on both fleets, for the staresheeps of the precious and nitpicking Admiral Hackbar were still busying themselves in getting into the perfect attack formation before they even jumped, while the exact opposite occurred in the formations under the direct lordship of the loud and aggressive Grandmouth Tartan. His boasts all just began to disappear as soon as he was informed. Was this alacrity to display their loyalty and efficiency to the Cunning One, or was it all due to Tartan wanting a crack at the vast hulk himself? Kronan could not be certain. But he figured if the Grandmouth was prone to treachery, now was probably a better time to find out than in the middle of a shooting and ramming war with the Emperor's own venereal navy, or something like that. So Kronan barked orders that elicited a smartening up of Hackbar's fleet and precipitated a much swifter turnaround in their preparations. But Kronan need not have worried, for when they arrived, the other half of his fleet were lurking around waiting for him. For it turned out that the hulk was not the only thing in the system. Strange that the shining picture thing generated at the behest of Bashtorr, or hologram as we know it, did not highlight these additional pleasures, but such is life. Or that is what some might have thought. True enough, there was not an overwhelming amount of this going on most days in the Waaargh, thinking, that is. But this did not change the circumstances they were all faced with, and Kronan smirked as he saw the chevrons appear on the screens, for the hulk was not alone at all. It had a large cluster of other ships around it, like shoals of fish around a mammoth squig shark. There were plenty of shapes in the void, and as the Orc Waaargh fleet closed in on the conglomeration there, Kronan could make out more and more of the smaller ships. They were like the venereal navy, but not the same. Oh, about the same size, speed and width, length and girth of the Hume ships, but these ones seemed one heck of a lot more spiky and pointy. and Kronan looked on and began to recognize some of the iconography emblazoned on the hulls of the escorting ships. There were 8 pointed stars, sigils of silliness. These were the worshippers of the same bunch as Toba, the farter, the waif, the thumper, and the bookie bird. They were sheeps of chaos. Now it would be at least a good few hours before the Ork Armada was even within firing range of the spiky human ships. So Kronan did what he always did when presented with an unknown foe. He sat on his golden thong, now installed in his mighty ship, and opened up his data slate. It was time to look into his vista, his scorecard, his menu. And when he did, he saw things he had never witnessed before. You see, the data slate was so full of unimportant cobblers that it was much akin to a search for anything of worth on either Reddit or Wiki. One line of investigation meant being led down endless rabbit holes of information, whatever they were, and often Kronan would just get bored. But he did enjoy the best bits, the menus. He had seen the dizzying numbers of differing forces of the Humies, but now, when he went in and tried to interrogate the slate for information on spiky ships, he was greeted with a whole new sub-menu altogether. And this is exactly the same time as he became aware of the existence of traitor Marines. Yes, he could barely contain his enthusiasm as he sat there ready to jump for joy. For the disgusting goddies of chaos had indeed gained supplication and adherence from some of the arse starters, meaning Marines were now on their side too. And just when Kronan thought he would lose interest in the data slate, he had spent many hours poring over it. Too many, some said. Well, only once. For Tiddles did not really understand the Orkish language of gobbledygook, but he understand tone all right. And anyone daring to besmirch the honor of his master, they were swiftly subjected to a close encounter of the dental kind. But even so, Kronan had a new leash on life. He thought he knew it all. Oh, yes, he did. But now, he could see the information about these traitor Marines, and their formations were, as always, as ludicrously named as the Loyalist, or even the Prim Anus Marines. How the Humies could ever be taken seriously, Kronan would never know. Kronan's eyes were saucer-wide when he saw the images, and then the details that went along with these new opportunities. There were the Alfalfa Legion, or something like that. Sneaky by the looks of it, lots of camouflage, etc. Tedious, but potentially cunning, for they too wore the colour of Waaargh, green. Then came the Iron Warriors, a drab-looking bunch who seemed utterly preoccupied with health and safety, but even Kronan had to admit that they didn't half have some large darker and massive killer cans with them. He would enjoy opening them up and eating the sweet treats inside. Next was the Fright Hordes. The data reported that they were very scary, which of course they may have been to an emaciated Humie, but Kronan could not take them seriously. They had huge ears on the side of their helms. They just looked daft to the cunning one. Of course, on to the Word Bearers, all dressed in red power armor, but who looked like talkers. Yuck. He would avoid them where necessary. Well, unless they got in his way, of course. Then he would just crump them. Then the entry on the Deathbard. From the name and the guts hanging out all over the place, they must have been the Fat One's musicians. It certainly seemed. Slow and ponderous, Kronan was quite enthusiastic to stomp all over these ones. Then onto the Temperor's Children, or something like that. Chopper makers, one would think. Like big mechs, but not so big and, well, a bit Eldar-looking, really. But he stopped a tad longer on the entry for the World Beaters. And by Gork's tastefully plaited anal beard, did they look like fun? All covered in Humie juice, they looked proper fighty. Kronan yearned to play with them. I meant to defeat them in manly battle, of course. Penultimately, there were the 1,000 Sums, mathematicians all. And in this one moment, Kronan realised he had become more of a connoisseur of crumping. For these ones didn't interest him in the slightest. Oh, he'd crump them if they happened to cross his path, but it would be far more for the full collection, for completionism, instead of out of any real zeal to fight these nerds. And then, the unsettling ones, the Black Legion, Apeldohn's lot. Overrated in Kronan's mind anyways. Obviously a sad knockoff of his own Black Legion. Wimps. But it did make Kronan wonder if old Apeldohn had been doing what the Emperor had obviously done so often. Was Apeldohn watching Kronan from the past, sealing his best names and moves? Kronan sighed. The Black Legion were no match for his Black Legion. Of this he was pretty much certain, like 99.99 recurring on the certainty scale. And if they crossed his path, where there would be no Legion to cast aspersions on his Legion ever again. And Kronan was now aware of Apeldohn like never before. He wanted to take that head. Not just for the kudos, the razzle-dazzle, the heady fame of it all. No. You see, Kronan took a very personal dislike to Apeldohn's hat. For it seemed to be made out of a hair squig, but had rings pushed through the squig to make it look taller, and hence Kronan knew that Apeldohn must have experienced crippling runty euphititis, what humans would call short man syndrome. Not that Kronan would have put it that way, of course, but it remained an astute and potentially useful observation for the future. For Kronan had been told in no uncertain terms that any bite big enough, any brawl brazen enough to attract the amount of human forces that were presently mustering in a system not so far away, this would surely draw the attention of old Apeldohn, for he was touted as the Waaargh Master, and Kronan took truck with that particular honorific. Yes, he did. And so it was that Kronan swore, when he had done his duty, when he had taken the head of a gold one, then maybe he would collect the lumping noggin of this self-proclaimed Waaargh Master. There would be a reckoning. Of this, Kronan was adamant. And so it was that the fleet of orcs ploughed towards the waiting Chaos Space Marine vessels, all clustered around a behemoth of a stair sheep, a space hulk, which unto itself was armed to the teeth. But Kronan and his admirals were only about to become aware of that next episode. Now Kronan had really lent into the showmanship since the events of the Squid Games, and he was prepared for just this eventuality. So, unlike so many others, he wished to at least appear fair, and that meant a draw. So, again utilizing the Vox across the entire armada, while their stair sheeps all ate the distance between their erupting point and the target, Kronan drew the lots. And before everyone, the 100 largest ships had all sent a grot head with their sigil on it. Said grot severed head had been kept in cold storage, and so it was that Kronan reached into the cold freezer, and before all, he called out the first score of ships that would take point. Now it was always understood that the Cunning One would be exactly where he needed to be at any given point in the battle, so there were no guarantees to be the first ship onto the breach, dear friends, but at the very worst, they would be in the first wave, and potentially running hard into the enemy with the Cunning One's flagship at the tip of the chopper. Thus Kronan pulled out the following: the middle finger, the Ed Butter, the Brutality, the Brutal, the Rump Piercer, the Crumper, the Buzzsaw, the Shootiest, the Death Blow, and the Ducker Boss. All meaty kill cruisers. The other ships were either smaller and generally nippier, like brute ram ships or Onslaught or Ravager attack class. But one in particular that stood out was the last. It was the old orc battleship, the Furious Squiggoth, one of the oldest and biggest ships that any had seen. It wallowed near the main fleet, under neither of the main admirals. This was the stair sheep of Gouger Grumbleblaster, known for his very staunch reaction to what he considered mutiny, which was rather an expansive list, really. Such highlights as not looking orky enough was easily understandable. but examples like "it's a tad too much of a morning," has a history of being right or asking questions, or wears a hair squig of a colour other than mauve, were less easily explained. Yet Gouger was a hoary old captain, and he was right tasty in a scrap, or so Kronan was informed. Now much of the fleet would take up position to prevent the hulk from slipping away. Not that it was likely. A hulk slipping away from you in the void is akin to standing next to a freeway and turning around one day to discover someone has pinched it. Or better still, if you tied someone up so tightly that they were only able to move their neck or to crawl forward on their eyebrows, then you popped out to boil a kettle for a cup of joe, only to find said encased rogue had made it away, and you could see clearly for about 200 acres in every direction. It was that unlikely. But Kronan would not be questioned. He did not wish the Chaos Marines to escape, was more the point. And he did not trust this being who had so mysteriously granted him the exact location of a mass transit system for the remaining orcs on Aquilonia. A gift worthy of Mork indeed. But we shall get to the why soon enough, for Kronan was having none of it, while ultimately playing along for the now. And so it was that the first wave was to go in, and, to the exact surprise of no one in the Armada whatsoever, Kronan's own flagship, the Mork Rampant, was at the very front. Yet this particular vessel was not as it appeared. For Isaac Newtone had walked its corridors for all the time that Kronan had been on his respite. For Kronan did take time out when he returned from Ulanor. I was going to mention it, but got carried away with tiddles and grots. But such is the way of chronicles. Often they can be out of order. Not like they are offensive or anything, not that kind of out of order, where you extract the urine in a bothersome way to others. No, but out of chronological order, that sort of out of order. Anyways, I will not dwell on it too much, for Kronan had weeks where he returned to his roots, and he finished off the Grot Rebellion, trained under the snakebites, and had other amazing, if not pertinent to the moment, adventures. But that is truly a tale for another time, when it's breezy and nice outside, that sort of thing. Or when you're snot bubble blubbing and need a pick-me-up after getting your maracas crushed in the vice of modern living. Dumped or given truly dung-flavoured news of the most spiritually or mentally excruciating kind. Hence, we shall push on to the events of the day, the lesson of the moments given in due course. For in his sojourn amongst his roots, amongst the snakebites, did the Kunnin one learn much indeed. It also gives me a perfect period to flash back to, when he learns an amazing lesson that he then enacts the benefit therefrom, when in a tight spot. Carte blanche for pulling a fast one is what I say. Others might identify it as a vacuous and inept attempt at polish, but that, as ever, is in your mind to judge. As chronicler, I can only present that which is, was, or will be, and I make no bones about always being right. Now, where the heck were we in the tale? Ah, yes, Isaac. For he had been as active as an orc half his age. He finally had his mitts on a mighty vessel of Waaargh, a battleship as powerful as any could ask. But of course, Isaac had made changes. For he was as infused with the power of the Waaargh as was his master, the big boss, the Cunning One. And in this instance, it was like his mind had been always working at half speed. Now, engorged with the Waaargh as he was unrestrained, unfettered. Ideas attacked his mind as never before, and in no time at all, the Mork Rampant was bristling. Not just with new ordnance of phenomenal darker, but also with armor and shielding upgrades that would make an Iron Hand move theirs faster than a 14-year-old ganger. Kronan's ship was meaty indeed, and it was a good job it was, because the Chaos Marine starships were damn disciplined, and they were very fighty indeed. Long-range missiles came at Kronan's ship like a swarm of angry squig wasps and impacted on the surface. The fleet behind him, Kronan now ordered the drums to begin. But odd indeed was the speed of the Orc fleet, and it put the Chaos Navy right off. For as they got closer, the Chaos fleet could see strange protrusions from the lead ship, like long spikes coming out the side of it, but with flat edges. These things were in huge banks on the port and starboard of it, and as they moved, the vessel would accelerate as if hit by a sudden burst of energy from its engines, the engines which stayed at exactly the same output through the entire approach. But why was this? Well, on that holiday, he did indeed spend time with the snakebites. They introduced him to boasts, things that could float on the big wet patches around the landmasses of Aquilonia. Like never-ending rivers, but these boasts could sail upon them. And Kronan had learnt their ways, and the ways of the freebooters who plied their trade there. When to raise the skull and crossed grots to indicate their intentions. How to board and butcher efficiently and with fun. And Kronan saw how boasts moved. It was all about wind, sometimes, but most often, simply elbow grease. And he saw no reason why the boasts of the void, the stair-sheeps, could not operate in the same way. Despite what ISAP might have maintained, speed was not only about engines. It was like victory. Over the Humies, over the Arstarters, over the entire galaxy. It began with elbow grease. And thus did Kronan share his plan with the mechs so that they could enact it. Now ISAP gave him a sniff that reminded all of a particularly nasty turd whiff being suddenly encountered whilst in polite company. Not that any of them knew what polite company would even look like, but the point stands. But none defied their lord, for was he not the cunning one, the greatest and brightest, the most orky of all orcs? They need not encompass his mighty plan to go about their toils, and so they did, and all was prepared. And so it was that Kronan's eyes flashed with a corona of green power as he let his right arm swing down, and then Kit Squisher McMurder bashed on 2 drums, echoing through the voxes across the ship. The lashers got to work. Okay, not all were really musically gifted, and didn't actually adhere to the beats of the drum. More freestyling on the soon torn and bloody backs of the pullers, but it did help the enthusiasm of said pullers. Particularly meaty and effective pullers had small squigs or snots thrown into their opened gobs to keep them healthy and hearty during the event, and thus this seemed the two-edged sword of true management of the many. For Kronan had arranged both carrot and stick to get the job done, the genius. The pullers did indeed pull, on huge rods that attached to oars that stuck out of the side of the Mork Rampant, and with each pull of the oars, the sheep and all its escorts seemed to almost jump forward in their vector. This meant that they were on the Chaos Navy before any had even fired up their lance batteries. The Mork Rampant dived right into the midst of the traitor ships and let fly with every single cannon, blaster, missile, darker of every kind into any and all around them. Alas, Kronan had made his first mistake, is what some might have said. For this was almost perfect, for what the marine ships believed was their forte. But today was not their day. For right behind the Mork Rampant was Gouger's furious Squiggoth. As the Chaos ships scattered out of the path of the Mork, the Squiggoth just ploughed into their keels in a line, and broke through 2 before it required to fire a shot. Ram ships sprang out of the wake of the Mork and Squiggoth, and pierced one grand cruiser in 2 places. Gouts of plasma discharged breathing from its wounds, like dragonfire in the night sky. The Rampant Piercer, Crumper, and Buzzsaw all flanked wide, coming in to try to swing behind and attack the Chaos Starships' rear-facing armor and their vulnerable engines. The Middle Finger, Brutal, Shootiest, and the Death Blow all swung over the top of the enemy fleet. The Ed Butter, Brutality, and Duckerboss swept under them. It was an attack far more directed than the Marines expected, by quite some margin, and before they knew it, each of the Chaos Sheeps were being boarded wholesale. As the Ork Ducker tore into them, teleporter arrays burst all over their decks, and amongst the main force to arrive were the Black Legion. The Orks deployed Kronan's Guard. Not that the Chaos Warriors were Black Legion, for they were not. These were not the highest on the list of opportunity, if I could be so bold. They were not the World Beaters, nor the Death Bard, They were word-blarers. Now things were very meaty and splashy in the halls and dorms of the word-blarer fleet. Bits laid about everywhere, for they were not premium-grade boys, but they were still Adipi Arse starters, and they were deeply fighty indeed. But the issue arose when they started chanting and whining away to their goddies, and tears across their ship appeared, and very spiky monsters came out of them to aid the blarers, and things seemed quite touch and go on one after another stair-sheep. Bashtorr now arose and stated he was about to get stuck in, and with that, he would appear on one sheep after another, clearing it of all demon types. They simply melted away when he boarded, and the greenskins could then redouble their efforts to take the sheeps from the blarers. The fighting was exceptional, and everyone who came back from it proclaimed it a raging success. It really was a rare old time had by all. As waves 2 through 4 lurched in, the Marines were finished off, and now all that remained was the taking of the Space Hawk, that which Kronan had already named the Orks of Omen. But first, Kronan indicated to this Bashtorr that he wanted a word in private, and Kronan led him down into a large area, a cargo bay of sorts, where Kronan had plenty of room to move about. For something had been niggling at Kronan from about 2 minutes after he had met this apparition who called himself a part of Mork. Something was not right. For the apparition had not offered, nor invited, elicited, or caused him a single fight. Not once did it even attempt to contend with Kronan's power, and he its. So, how could he be of the gods Mork and Gork? And Kronan knew, with the certainty of a swimmer in a public pool, that over the session that they probably drunk about 3/4 of someone else's piss, that this thing was not of Gork, and certainly not of Mork. Or was it the other way round? No matter. And so it was that Kronan reached out, not just with his own meaty and quite stabby and rendy slabs of hands, but also with all the righteous wrath of a pure son of Mork, when tempted by a demon of another god, and he beat the living shit out of it. I mean, he really went to town. There was spitting, gouging, butting, pulling off of the silly wing things, a giggle when Kronan twisted the arms until they were barely connected, and then slapped the screaming Bashtorr with its own flopping hands. He took its head under his arm and ran it at a wall. The thunderous clash broke both wall and head. Yet Kronan then leapt to the highest stairs on the bay, and then he swung and landed on the back of the being with his elbow extended. Kronan then picked up the tattered and dissipated, ragged, truly smashed apparition, and heard its last words. Well, almost. "How in the name of the warp are you able to do this?" Kronan ignored it. Kronan then picked it up by its legs, swung its head down, and then thumped the being pretending to be Bashtorr's last fragments of head into the ground. Its spine snapped, like old twigs under a kin's fat transport wheels. It crumpled into a pile of misshapen limbs as he let go. As the last wisps of its soul evaporated back into the warp, a last sigh escaped its throat. "I'll get you back for this, you bastard." And Kronan knew all he needed to know. It seemed that Toba had made better, more cunning friends in hell. But clearly, no more art than he was. Ha! The power of the Waaargh left Kronan. And his arms slowly stopped shimmering. Green, of course. Others might say his was a flatulent cacophony or symphony, released as he relaxed after a deed well done, and done well. But either way, Kronan was now knackered, as about 20 of his guards yomped into the room to join in the obvious fight that they had heard. Right into his blast radius. All looked even more green than usual, crestfallen at the lack of a rumble, but elated, of course, that their lord had triumphed once again. and so they mooched out, gagging. Kronan went to sleep, giggling. That was bloody fun. He would now have to see if he was now Humy wizard-proof. That felt too good to not repeat somehow, as soon as possible. And of course, fast-trapping his knobs was the cherry on the top. And so he arranged the arming of storming parties to delve into the hulk, but this would take time. And so it was that Kronan took this time to return to his quarters. He then giggled himself to sleep over the events of the day, and acknowledged that very soon he would be in command of the Orks of Omen, the biggest stare sheep he had ever heard of. And so he swept into the sleep of the just. To be continued.